Okay, let's start with a provocative question. What if the biggest source of tension in Asia isn't rising China, but the United States itself? It's a huge claim, right? Well, in this explainer, we're diving into an incredible intellectual duel that's going to challenge everything you might think you know about the US-China rivalry. And this quote, this really gets right to the heart of the whole debate. It's from the Indian scholar Gautam Mudar, and he's basically asking, hey, what if the US isn't the peacekeeper in Asia? What if it's the one stirring the pot? So on one side, you've got John Mearsheimer. He's one of America's most famous international relations thinkers, and he argues that conflict is just baked into the system. It's inevitable. But on the other side, you've got Gautam Mudar, an Indian intellectual who completely flips the script. He argues the U.S. presence is the real source of tension. And look, this isn't your average debate. This is a fundamental challenge to the way the West often sees the world. All right, first up, let's break down Mearsheimer's side of things. We've got to understand his core argument, something he laid out years ago. And the crazy thing is, he believes it's all playing out exactly like he said it would. So his big theory is called offensive realism, and the premise is pretty stark, you know? It basically says that in the rough and tumble world of global politics, the best defense is a really good offense. He argues that to survive, big powers like the US and China are pretty much hardwired to try and dominate their own backyards, to become what's called a hegemon. And this isn't about good guys or bad guys. For him, it's just the cold, hard, unchangeable logic of power. And here's how he breaks it all down, step by step. First, the U.S. helps make China rich. That economic wealth then gets turned into military power. It's just what countries do. Then, this newly powerful China will naturally try to dominate Asia, just like the U.S. has always dominated the Americas. So what does the U.S. do? It has to try and contain China. And the end result of all this? An intense, dangerous rivalry where war is a very real possibility. For Mearsheimer, this isn't a guess. It's a predictable sequence of events. And Mearsheimer points to a specific moment when it all changed, around 2017. He says this wasn't some random policy shift. Nope. He argues this is the year China truly became a great power, and that change structurally forced the U.S. to switch from engagement to containment. You know, a policy of actively trying to box China in. It was a flip of a switch, dictated by the system itself. Okay, so that's Mearsheimer's take. Pretty grim, right? But now let's switch gears and look at the counter-argument from Gautam Mudar. He basically looks at this ironclad theory and says, hold on a minute, you're missing the most important parts of the story. See, where Mearsheimer sees an inevitable clash, like two planets on a collision course, Mudar sees something totally different. He says this tension isn't some abstract law of geopolitics. No, it's created by very real, on-the-ground things. Things he argues Mearsheimer's theory just doesn't account for. And he brings three crucial variables into the mix. First, nationalism. He calls it the most powerful ideology on the planet, something that makes invading another country like kicking a hornet's nest. Second, there's history. Specifically, all these modern conflicts are really just old border disputes left over from the collapse of empires. And third, and this is his biggest point, there's the massive U.S. military presence. All the alliances and bases, he argues, are what escalate these local squabbles into huge global confrontations. And to back this up, Mudar throws out a really interesting fact. He points out that China has actually resolved 10 out of its 14 historical border conflicts peacefully. So what's his takeaway? Well, he says that when these are just treated as local border issues, without a superpower getting involved, they can actually be solved. It's the U.S. presence, he claims, that pours gasoline on the fire. All right, so you've got two completely different ways of looking at the world. Now, let's put them to the test. How do these theories actually explain the real-world conflicts, the most dangerous hotspots in Asia? This is where it gets really interesting. And let's start with the big one, the place everyone is watching, Taiwan. What is really at the root of this incredibly tense situation? Well, for Mearsheimer, it's pretty clear. It's about China's drive for power and its deep-seated nationalist belief that Taiwan belongs to it. Simple as that. But Mudar sees it differently. He frames it as a very specific post-colonial dispute and argues that the key thing making it so dangerous isn't just China's growing military, it's a massive geostrategic presence of the United States. Okay, next up, the tension in the East China Sea. We're talking about that bitter dispute between China and Japan over a few tiny little islands. What's the real story there? And once again, you see the exact same clash in thinking. Mearsheimer says, look, this is an old, historic conflict. It would be there even if the U.S. didn't exist. But Mutter says, not so fast. He agrees there'd be a dispute, sure, but he argues the U.S. presence is what turns it from a manageable, low-level spat into this high-stakes, polarized confrontation. And finally, what about the India-China border? We've seen deadly clashes up in the Himalayas in recent years. Why did things escalate so badly, so suddenly? This is fascinating because they have totally different answers. Mearsheimer's explanation fits his theory perfectly. China became a great power around 2017, so it naturally became more aggressive. It's all about the external power balance. But Mudar looks inside India. He says the real reason for the escalation was the rise of Hindu nationalism in India after 2014, a shift in domestic politics that created a need to rally the country against a foreign enemy. So when you step back, this whole debate really boils down to one thing. It's not just about who's right or wrong. It's about which lens we should be using to understand the world. Are we looking at just the cold, hard skeleton of power, or do we need to see the full picture, the flesh and blood of history and politics? And I think these two metaphors really capture it perfectly. You've got the Mearsheimer lens, which is like a sharp scalpel. It cuts away all the noise, history, politics, ideology, to reveal what he sees as the simple, unchangeable skeleton of power politics underneath. Then you have the Mudar lens, which is multidimensional. It says, no, you have to look at all that stuff you just cut away. The flesh and blood, the history, the nationalism, that's where the real story is. So this incredible duel doesn't really give us any easy answers, does it? But it leaves us with some really profound questions to think about. Is great power conflict really an objective iron law of the world, like gravity? Or is that very idea a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy? And maybe the most critical question of all, what if the U.S. military presence isn't the solution, but actually the primary source of the tension? So in the end, which do you think we need more to make sense of our world? Do we need the sharp scalpel of Mearsheimer or the multi-dimensional lens of Mudar? And look, the choice you make has huge implications. Because if Mearsheimer's right, the future is just about managing a dangerous, unavoidable conflict. But if Mudar is right, well, then the path to peace might require a complete, radical rethinking of America's entire role in Asia. It's the difference between being a spectator at a tragedy you can't stop or being an actor who can still change the script.